people talk about emerging markets, and the two obvious questions rise is, what is special, what is unique about emerging markets, Asia's emerging markets? Once we understand that difference or that uniqueness, how does it impact the business strategy of the company? So with that, I'm going to start from the rightmost side with Jeff Hardee.
Thank you, Ravi. Well, I think when we look at the emerging markets in Asia, it's the size that stands out right away. We have China, we have India, Indonesia. So emerging markets in Asia, Asia represents 60% of the population, the global population. Emerging markets represent most of that. So we've got tremendous opportunities here. And then after that, we have Vietnam and also, of course, Thailand, Philippines with large populations. So we have a lot of countries in the region with large populations. But one of the distinguishing factors of the emerging markets in Asia is that many have been able to sustain high rates of GDP growth over a long period of time. And this is not easy to do. IMF tracks 180 countries, and they've tracked since 1950 growth. And in any one decade, 1/4 of the countries, 135 of the 80, about 180 are emerging, 1/4 will achieve 5% growth or higher. Over a 2-decade period, 1/3 will be able to sustain that over 2 decades. Over 3 decades, only 1 in 10 can sustain that. It happens that there were 6 countries that over 4 decades have been able to sustain their growth rates of 5% or higher, and they're all in Asia. So there was Thailand, Taiwan, South Korea, Singapore, Malaysia, and Hong Kong. So interesting that Asian countries have been able to sustain high rates of growth. And I think that part of that is government policies, in fact. And if you look across the region, we have governments that have an orientation to a certain extent to openness to trade and investment. If you look at Taiwan, Hong Kong, these countries. There's been general political stability in the region among the higher growth rate countries. And there's been momentum to open markets. You've got the countries like Japan and others that have tried to export for growth. And that's led to policies that have encouraged that kind of trade, and they've been able to ride on that. So I think those are the real reasons the Asian markets have been able to grow well. And when we look at opportunities for the IT sector, what does this mean to the industry? Well, 60% of the growth in the IT sector will be in emerging markets in the coming years. So obviously for a company, you have to have an emerging market strategy. And it's not easy to have a strategy distinct in each country. We have these countries such as China that has many big cities, huge cities, to make sure you can go in and cater to each of those cities. Start out the first, second-tier markets, and then eventually get down to the 5th and 6th tier. It's a challenge. You have the same thing in India, dealing with the different governments and the provincial level governments as well. So these are some of the challenges that I would point out, and like to stop there.
As I think about it, I answer the question, I guess, in a couple of different ways. One is I don't generally tend to think about emerging markets that much. I tend to think about markets. So this is partly a little bit of an issue with working for some U.S. multinationals, because when I try and articulate what we're doing in China or what we're doing in India, I do not tend to articulate that in the context of an emerging market. For me, those are highly developing markets, and I make that difference or make that distinction. Because for me, Myanmar and other markets are emerging. Made a trip to Myanmar not so long back, and when you have a hard time getting a cell phone connection or no internet connection, cannot use credit cards, everything has to be paid in cash, as some of you may know. That's a more challenging market in which to do business. When I think about other markets, I tend to think about them in clusters or groups. So I tend to think about some of our markets in ASEAN and elsewhere in the Middle East and Africa in groups where there's some similar dynamics. So a lot of what we're doing right now is trying to cluster together what we're doing in China with what we're doing in Russia and looking for some of those commonalities. I think the areas that are unique or exciting or important would be just the young age of a lot of the professionals in a lot of these markets. I don't have the same grasp of statistics that my friend Jeff has, but there's certainly, when you take a look at what's happening in India or in China, markets that are important to me personally, like Cambodia, the age is impressive, meaning 25, 26, 27, where people are really getting out and doing something exciting, and there's a lot of innovation. So my particular passion is around quote-unquote innovation in Asia, and a lot of what I'm trying to promote and would love to have discussions to the extent that you'd like to later is around innovation occurring within Asia, original innovation, not incremental innovation. Again, to draw the distinction, you can improve a product and patent it, and that's incremental innovation, or you can come up with something new. And part of what I've been pushing for is to have EMC, for one, do a lot of original innovation. So we went from 0 engineers in Asia to now 5,000 over the last 5 years or so, working on worldwide product release as opposed to Asia only or customized product. We're doing worldwide development from Singapore, from China, from India. We went through all the issues around what are the intellectual patent concerns, how do we have joint ventures that we feel reasonably secure with, and so on and so on. And there's been a lot of scars in my back and experience around that. But important things for us to think about if we want to be a relevant company around the world. So for me, it's innovation, originality, youth, excitement, enthusiasm. Those are the things that I associate most with Asia. And I lived in Europe and ran a European portfolio for 10 years, which was also exciting, but the real action, as I'm sure all of you know.
This here, what has been said about the demography, the growth, the enthusiasm of Asia and other developing markets in, say, Latin America and Africa is very, very true. Compare that to the situation in Europe, whereby actually things are quite different, as we know. But Europe was more or less on the path of Asia after the war, when there was a bit younger demography, there was an enormous hunger and passion for moving ahead, having a better life. And that's the drivers, as Steve was just saying, that is so fascinating for us as Europeans. I mean, if we think of the GDP part generated by Asia, it's today about 30% of the world GDP is here. And some people think that in 2015 it's going to be about 50%. However, if you go back to the 18th century, it was actually 60%, because it was mainly China. China was the most important factor. So basically, we are going back to where we were 300 years ago. So, not to waste time on what has been said, one difference I find that was touched upon, I think, by Jeffrey, is that doing business in Asia, politics seems to drive a lot of the business, while in Europe, of course, there is politics, but here it's a lot about government, about your connections, about who you know rather than what you know. And that's a very interesting fact that sometimes Western companies forget. It's also a bit of a dangerous situation, because if you come too close to the powers that be, they tend to change very quickly. So I would say one has to be mindful about that difference, one has to manage it in a balanced way. That's it.
So let me repeat a few things, because it's a segue into what I really want to say. Asia is big, and by that I mean it is diverse. Asia is Asia, but Singapore is not Vietnam, and India is not Japan, and so on and so forth. There are emerged markets, developed markets, frontier markets, and everything in between. So I agree with what Steve said there. I think there are some unique qualities here. Again, I agree. We are in a region that is skewed to the left demographically. It is very young. That means future opportunity. It is fast growing. There is a thirst for knowledge, and there is an importance put by families almost across Asian cultures on the importance of education, saving for education. I also tend to think there is a focus on progress and rule change. Some governments are faster than others and further down the curve on that. And I agree with Göran, there is unlike in some of the other parts of the world, there is an involvement by government in private industry that sometimes is useful and sometimes is quite counterproductive. I think what that implies, at least from my experience, as an international banker, but now as an entrepreneur building businesses, is you better be flexible. This is a fast-growing environment. Things change quickly. Rules change quickly. But at the same time, you need to have a long-term focus. And I think that means being persistent, but it doesn't mean knocking your head against the wall exactly the same way every time. You can be persistent and be adaptable at the same time. Try something slightly different, but persist. We've seen this. I spend a lot of time in Vietnam at the moment, investing and building companies there. And without a long-term focus and without being persistent yet adaptable, we might as well go home.